I think. Can you do that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Everyone, we're about ready to start. There's 3 panels going on today, so I know we're competing against 2 others. And we're certainly competing after one of the most impressive speeches that I've heard in years. I feel very comfortable here because I was here all day yesterday. How many are in I don't have my glasses on. How many are in restructuring? Any people? Yeah. A couple people?
I'm in restructuring, too.
Oh, of course. I was sitting here for 6 hours yesterday. We'll let everyone introduce themselves. First, thanks for all coming. For those of you who don't know me, I'm John Lilly. I'm professor of finance, teaching corporate restructuring, but I also head the Impact Investing Initiative at UCRA, and do some side stuff with Stewart Soros's Economic Development Fund, with a particular emphasis on Africa and Asia. And I retired last year from JP Morgan after being an investment banker. So some of you know me from trying to tackle me, trying to get interviews and help on your resumes from time to time, which I'm always glad to do.
Hi, I'm Paul Bernstein. I'm from the Pershing Square Foundation, based in New York. I was very conscious when I was thinking about this panel that here are 3, unless there's something about Jordan and John, I don't know, 3 non-Africans speaking in this panel. I don't know what that says about any of it. Although I was told over lunch that I have to claim my African heritage, as Ms. Barrow was telling us all before, since I'm the only member of my family who isn't South African. And since I'm married to a South African born in Zimbabwe, apparently that makes me an African, so I'm proud to be here as an African. I'm from UK originally, and I got involved in the world of social change when I was living in Cape Town, involved in setting up a pretty large treatment program for HIV 10 years ago, when treatment was almost non-existent. That was a changing career from telecoms, where I was before. I worked with Vodacom in South Africa and Vodafone and various other things. And what initially was helping out a very interesting organisation called Absolute Return for Kids that wanted someone with a commercial background, basically to write them a business plan for this program that could have been a sort of career break for a few months into a career change. That 10 years later has me in New York, involved in a foundation. We fund globally, less interested in particular sectors than we are finding exceptional people who are driving innovations that we think can scale and have major impact. So we have a particular involvement in agriculture and smallholder agriculture with a number of organisations we talk about in different parts of Africa, as well as many other organisations, including healthcare, and with big backers of Human Rights Watch. Maybe we can talk about the importance of justice and that side of it in any of the social success. So it's a diverse set of interests.
Thank you. My name is Jordan Levy. I'm the Managing Director of Ubuntu Education Fund. Ubuntu Education Fund is based in Zwide Township in Port Elizabeth, South Africa. And I've actually been down, and I am an American as well, but I've been down in South Africa the last 10 years and been deeply involved in the issues going on within the forest communities. And I think maybe one of the good things about having us in this panel means, for me at least, it's because the South Africans are down there still doing the work on the ground, and that's where they're needed most, and that capacity that you start to see building on the ground has allowed people like me who are in the organization to travel a bit more and represent that South African point of view in forums like this. But just to give you a little bit of background on Ubuntu Education Fund, it's an organization that started incredibly small. And I'll give you a very short version, and I'm open to any questions. But started with 2 guys in a broom closet in a primary school in the township, which is the only way to start anything, right? And is now an organization that employs 70 people, 98% of whom are from the communities that we serve. And it takes children, we say, from cradle to career. But what that really means for us is that it's a comprehensive and long-term approach assisting those in disadvantaged communities. So our theory is that it is very important, instead of to think of scale as how many people you can reach, but instead how deeply you can reach in each individual. And we happen to do that through education, through medical approaches, through psychosocial support. But we believe that our innovation is actually the model that is the community service delivery mechanism, as opposed to the various things we do within those areas. But we are also very proud of what we've been able to accomplish in those areas. So that's the short version, and we'll see where the discussion goes, and hopefully I can shed some light on what everybody else is interested in.
Jordan, how has your thinking evolved since you started this? What were the challenges? Many of our students, this is a business school, but we also have a strong concentration in entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship. How's your thinking changed since you started this? What lessons that work in both the African context as well as any other context?
Sure. I mean, there's so many different directions I can go with that question, I think, but I'll just pick, some that are more personal to me. First of all, I went down initially to South Africa to volunteer for 6 months, and I've been there 10 years. So that framework can show you what I've learned and what needs to be learned about getting involved in any context like this. 6 months is not going to change the world. And when I was 23, I didn't quite know that, although it seems logical. You do find a lot of funders and a lot of young individuals who believe they can change the world in 6 months. Now, I'm not discouraging you from taking advantage of, let's say, the Duke Study Abroad program and going that way. There's a lot you can contribute. But when you look at an organization and when you set goals for a larger body and a community, I don't think you can look at true outcomes in a 6-month period, even a year, probably 2. You have to look at those more long term. You can look at outputs in those. And I think I was very idealistic. And I thought that my talents and skills were going to, drive this huge machine and make such a change. What I learned was I needed a few years to learn how to fit into what was going on. And in that way, I can make a difference. So it's definitely about long term. Somebody said this morning, education is a 30-year cycle or 30-year process. That, to me, struck very true, and I would not have known that at the beginning. That's a short answer to it.
So it's tough to do this as a hobby.
Well, yes, I know you're kind of kidding, but you'd be surprised how many people do, and the impact that they think they're going to have, and the danger of that. There's an intense danger to doing this as a hobby, because I'm either I have the money or the time or skills in a certain area, and I've been extremely successful in other facets of life. There are these, I'm describing mentality. There's these people who are so disadvantaged that anything I do for them is positive. But often you're contributing to the problem when you do that, because either you're raising expectations with no true return on what you've done, or you're meddling in things that you don't quite understand. It's the same thing as any business. So if somebody's running a bank and they have a certain set of expertise, and I'm really good at what I do in development, if I showed up at your office and said, I can give you my time for 6 months, look at me, I'm really smart, you'd say, get out of here. You're not going to control our investments. But yet, somebody who's really good at other things comes into our world very often and expects that they can immediately kind of, get involved at the highest level. And there's shades of gray in there. I'm not saying that there's not a huge use and a great thing, but I think your career sounds like saying that you came in, it took you a long time to become a part of the whole thing, and it takes time to really get involved.
How do you manage the expectation of donors and other stakeholders? Because you're in some ways an intermediary between the outcome and the input. There's certainly talent that one must develop.
It's spending. It's a lot of time. A lot of time. before I came down to breakfast this morning, I was on my computer managing the expectations of donors. When I leave here today, there will be a number of emails on my iPhone about that, and I think it's managing the expectation of investors, things you learn about. It's truly trying to communicate and get across key messages in ways that are truly going to be taken in. There's a marketing element to it. You have to come up with catchphrases and things like that. As callous as that seems to get things across, you have to utilize things that gain legitimacy. In fact, there's, for example, just something I'm thinking about today because it's an issue today. There's an incredible TED Talk that's kind of going viral right now by a guy named Dan Pallotta. I don't know if anybody's seen it, but it's all about why it's important to truly invest a great deal of money into development and development organizations to have a good return, and why the $1 a day or a cup of soup a day model will never change the world. And I highly recommend it. But the reason I bring it up in response to your question is that because it's a TED Talk that's gone viral and it has that legitimacy, that's one of the tools I'm using right now to manage donor expectations and to get my message across. You have to, like any business, find ways of framing the issues that are key to your business where you can kind of confront some of the issues where you don't want to devalue some of the smaller contributions they may have made or the thinking that they have about how to invest in your organization, but you want to promote them to give to you or to invest in you or to work with you in a way that after, let's say, 15 years as an organization is actually going to work. And you want to do that in a way that's very gentle and very diplomatic, but that shows your business and everything. It's not that we're always right or anything else, or I have the corner on these ideas, just that when I know something is not going to work for our particular organization, managing the expectation and doing it. So utilizing different tools, marketing, talking with PR firms, all those kind of things are important.
So let's think of it from George's perspective and sort of the outcomes approach. Paul, with the been very modest about both your work as well as the generosity of Bill Ackman and his wife in what they do. How do you look at this from the standpoint of the long term, and how do you make the selection as to what kind of short-term results you wish to see versus long-term results? And how do you weigh that decision-making when you're thinking of worthy causes, charities, or businesses?
I don't know if there's a single answer to that question. Partly because the nature of what you can get involved in is so varied that there are many different ways of thinking about it. But often, actually, I think I just want to return to something that links back to what Jordan was saying before about the relationship between the short-term win that shows something is really possible and then the long-term impact of it. The two are always going to be related. So when we started in South Africa, which as I said was 10 years ago, I almost sort of need to wind the clock back, because when you think about a lot of the conversations now that we treat as normal, of course we're not normal then, and things like the idea that firstly the idea of social investment was not exactly social and investment didn't go together that naturally, and the idea that you would focus on measurable outputs and outcomes to what it was that you were doing and really hold yourself accountable to it. And of course your donors should be holding you accountable to it if you're delivering those results. And that was the perspective that we took. And equally to think about the relationship between what you're doing today and where it might be going. So just briefly, the story of how ARC got involved in antiretrovirals was they were a young organisation. ARC, for those who are not familiar, it's like the UK equivalent of the Robin Hood Foundation in New York. So the sort of collective hedge fund philanthropy with all the principles of accountability and measurement that go with it, and some very strict approach to it. They happen to be internationally focused. But they were looking and saying, listen, and they're a children's charity as well. If we're a children's organisation, how can we ignore HIV? It was, and of course unfortunately still is, thankfully to a slightly lesser degree, one of the biggest issues internationally affecting affecting children, and all the stories about the, as it was at the time, the number of orphans. So they commissioned some research to see what could be done for children who are being orphaned because of AIDS. And after 6 months, someone walked in when they were doing a research trip in Cape Town and said, well, the best thing you could do for those kids is stop them being orphaned in the first place, keep their mothers alive. And that was the origin of the program. So they went to the doctor and said, come up with a plan. He came back and said, I'd like to treat 150 patients. And that was in the context where the best program in the world at the time, which was Doctors Without Borders in Cape Town, it was phenomenal. I mean, they broke the ground on this. They and Partners in Health and two others, PH, were doing it in Haiti, proved you could actually do what a lot of people in the West said was impossible, and that was to deliver treatment in a resource-poor setting. It was a very patronising view at the time, but they proved they could do it. So this guy came back and said 150 patients. And they were sort of looking at saying, there are 500,000 people in South Africa needing treatment today. The number is, I think, around 2 million now. What's 150 patients? Now, actually, what we want to do is add a zero to that. Let's aim for 1,500 patients, and by the way, we're going to do that in a year. And remember, that's 3 times what MSF had done with a phenomenal program in 3 years. We argued about it. Everyone said it was impossible. The government of the Western Cape were brave enough to partner with us to do it. I knew nothing. I'm going to come from the outside. I had no background in working in HIV at the time. It was my job to deliver the plan for that, and then to get it off the ground with the government. So, take the clock forward 12 months, and we got to 1,350 patients. I'm absolutely confident if the target had been 1,000, we would have got to 900. If it was 150, we would have got to 140, whatever it would have been. But what they did, and I claim no credit for it, was they focused on the long-term need of the country, and to what Mubara was saying this morning, so they identified that real need, and instead of sort of saying we'll feel good because we'll treat at 150 months and 150 more people will still be alive thanks to us, which would have been phenomenal, every single one of those lives is extraordinary, but actually say how can we do something in the short term which has measurable results that helps the country get onto the path for that long-term goal. And of course, I don't know the numbers in South Africa today, but the result is, thanks to what a lot of people did, of which we were just one, there are now many hundreds of thousands, probably must be millions actually, well over 1 million I imagine, on treatment in South Africa, and 8 million people globally coming out of that program. So I think the two are very much related. What I think was smart about the design there was appreciating the value of the short-term proof point to the long-term gain, and I would say that's probably a factor in each of the decisions you're making that you're having to balance between those two.
That's very helpful. And again, I'll ask you, how is your personal thinking changed since you started, and how has the thinking of the foundation changed, just as it's evolved over the past few years, given that this is, all 3 of us are using words that were never used in a business school 5 years ago, and were never used in any school 10 years ago. The lexicon which we're using never been used. But how is, even in this short period of time, how's your thinking changed, if it has, how's it evolved, and same with the foundation?
Probably the most significant discussion that feels like we're still at the early stage, and I reckon most people are still at the early stage, is the question of the difference between charity and investment in terms of what you are trying to achieve. What I was first involved with was a public health initiative. It was a partnership with the public sector. It used a purely philanthropic model to do it. What interests me today more and more is where is the alternative, more financially sustainable way of achieving similar goals. So we are often looking at organisations from the perspective of their sustainability, not only because, of course, it means they're not dependent on our grants in the long term, but if they really want to scale to the size of the problem, as opposed to just be a little dot addressing that problem, then the financial resource to get to it is much greater than philanthropic money is ever going to be. So always looking for those sort of more, whether you want to call them commercial in the way that the impact investing world sees, or at least sustainable solutions that actually can then grow much more actively and quickly.
And we had a lot of discussions around the business school around this word sustainable. And whenever we have topics like this, and for those of you, how many are first years? You heard me in the GIE, remember talking about Leapfrog, the HIV/AIDS insurance provider in South Africa. What's the word sustainable mean to you? Just when you hear the word sustainable, what is that? Give me the factors that go into it.
Three obvious dimensions to it. One is the financial one, which we're referring to. The second one is sustainability of impact. What I love about Ubuntu is because it's a deep intervention in people's lives, the impact on, one of the things that was our watchword at ARC and still is in what we're doing at Pershing Square was transformation. And my understanding of transformation is, you go from here to here and you can't go back. And that sustainability of impact is a second dimension. And the third dimension is probably sustainability of initiative in terms of the effort that you started, whatever the impact is, the effort that you started, how it continues.
Very, very, very similar thoughts. Maybe not adding on it, but just illustrating a bit. The way we think about it at Ubuntu, for example, is what are sustainable changes that you can make in someone's life that fit that definition. So, for example, the way you kind of conceive of it, in my opinion, is to look at your own life and think of what changes that you've made in your own life are actually sustainable, as opposed to temporary interventions that don't have a huge effect on your life, whether you're trying to quit smoking or change your eating habits or earn a certain degree and a certain level of status that will affect your future career. There are certain things that you do in a human life that can be sustained, that can be taken out in terms of the impact. And there are certain things that are mere interventions. So when I look at programs, people often ask me, what programs do you like, what interventions? I like ones that have a focus, as you're talking about strategically, on making those type of changes that are actually going to have that kind of long-term sustainable impact on somebody's life, and they're usually long-term. But of course, the financial sustainability of the institution that's going to drive that is very important. And then, is there a cyclical strategy within where, for example, if your model happens to be building leaders, will those leaders actually then come back and contribute in some way or another to the initial goal, and does that model start to become self-sustaining?
Before I ask my next question, I had a fascinating dinner last night where part of sustainability is our diets, and I urge each of you to talk to Jordan afterwards. I learned how I could increase my energy level if I went gluten-free. I was eating a hamburger at the Waduk at the time.
And I just know about this. I don't actually
all the other participants are the healthiest people in the world. So let's keep that in mind. But what's the role in each of your activities, both at Pershing Square and the individual contributions you make, as well as what you're doing? What's the role that the government plays? It's something that is something we have a constant discussion and dialogue about in the business school and in business schools throughout the country. How does government work with you, alongside you? Does it work against you? How can we make it better?
First question is which government? And the answer to that for us is the U.S. government. And the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR, funded us for 5 years. Very significant funding, and really, in Ubuntu's case, took Ubuntu from kind of here to here in terms of business. I don't know who's in the room or who's represented it, but I'll speak candidly. It was a blessing in that sense. It was also my greatest nightmare. If you want to talk about expectations and managing donor expectations, I've never had a harder one. I found it very difficult to be guided by what I felt were winds coming from places that didn't quite understand what was getting there, and very much got into some bit of battles, diplomatic battles about what is impact, and that's where some of my thinking comes from. And numbers, in my opinion, and there are, these are all debatable, obviously, numbers versus numbers versus impact. And I think a lot of time the search for numbers is a problem, and the numbers that are being thrown out about how many people are, some effect has been had on them are inaccurate. So that's the U.S. government. The Canadian government, also a funder, and somewhere in the middle of the scale, still a funder, so can't talk too much about that. Interesting. I'm just showing because the reason I also mention these governments is to show that the money often is not coming from within South Africa quite yet, which is a big passion of mine to get more money from South Africa. The South African government is a partner, not really a funder, to my chagrin in a lot of ways. But they are, where we have excellent relationships is local, on the ground partnerships with, for example, the Department of Health. So we have an on-site HIV pediatric clinic, and without being part of the larger system, without having cross referrals to the local health clinics, there's plenty of problems, we can discuss all of that. Without that, we can't have impact. We can't have that sustainability. People move, people get treatment from different ways. If mom's being treated in this local clinic, and and we're treating one of the children, you can't have that without a synergy, without working together, without being a true partner. There's bureaucracy, there's this, there's that. It's a very complex relationship that I could dive into on many specific questions. But really, we have a great partnership with the South African government, especially locally. A lot of frustrations, and I wish that some of the money that's not being spent in the budget could be allocated more effectively down to service providers who have found an effective way to do that. So sure.
And what about the foundation? How does it work with governments at all?
I would couple of pieces around that. The first is a somewhat theoretical one for us. Bearing in mind we're a foundation, so we're not operating inside any particular environment, although obviously the US government is important to us. But our philosophy in many of the programs that we support, particularly those that are led by social entrepreneurs, is that we will fund at what we would call the inflection point for growth. So if you imagine sort of someone on an S-curve of growth, so you start out sort of relatively slowly doing your pilots and your proof of concept, and then there comes a point where you've proved it, and now you're really ready for scale, and that's the point where we're often involved. And then later on it matures, and obviously your size and often your financial needs are very substantial and very different. So we want to help people get up the curve at its steepest point, which is actually a place where there are relatively few funders, unfortunately. But our assumption is that we're not going to be, firstly, we don't have the scale to be able to fund when they hopefully are incredibly successful. And secondly, it's not our skill set. So our assumption is, and this somewhat depends on what kind of intervention we're talking about, but then if it's not something that is going to be financially self-sustaining, that you have to be heading towards someone else being able to pay for it. So we are very happy if a program we've been funding attracts funding, let's say, from USAID. Or that it's designed itself so that once it's really got somewhere, it will be so attractive, and this was our model for antiretrovirals, it's so attractive to the government that is responsible for delivering public health that they will integrate it into their system. And by the way, the program has to be designed so it can be. So for example, you don't pay your doctors and nurses more than government pays, otherwise no one's ever going to get employed inside the public system. So it's a really important partner for how things can really get to scale. The second piece is government as enabler, where we are big backers of something called 1 Acre Fund, which works with smallholder farmers in Africa, providing them with a package of inputs, training, group formation, and then access to market with their products, and they double net income of subsistence farmers. It's a phenomenal program that is at a remarkable scale. They couldn't do it without a benign and the very least environment in Kenya, Rwanda, Burundi, which are the three countries they're operating in. And actually now there's a very interesting dynamic. Kenya is suffering from a terrible maize disease that is blighting its crop. It's a disease that's happened in this country 20 or so years, 20, 30 years ago. And guess what? Government is slow. Government recognises it's there, is conflicted as to what it can say about it, so it doesn't sort of brew up a crisis, and slow to actually respond to it. So One Acre is able to play a role with government in helping change the crop cycle so that actually you can stop the spread of the disease. It's extremely important. What interests me actually about it in another sense with government is, as I said, One Acre. If you ever get the chance to meet one social entrepreneur, go meet Andrew Yoon, who runs the One Acre Fund. He's absolutely phenomenal. Andrew's ambition is to reach 1 million farm families across Africa in 10 years. I mean, those are numbers that are remarkable by any estimation. But by his own admission, if he does that, and I'm confident he will only actually tackle the growth rate of the number of those extremely poor subsistence farms. There are 50 million now, it's growing at 1 million a year. So if you're really going to deal with the problem that is farmers that are unable, that are there, that are trying to make good on very small plots of land, in all sorts of complicated land ownership environments across the continent, then someone else is going to have to help him scale it. And I think there is a possibility of working with government and organisations like the World Bank in order, not that Andrew Yoon suddenly spreads his model to 60 countries across Africa, but that others are able to learn from what he has done and adopt it. And I think government is really important as to how that could happen.
So you may have heard when I lectured to the GIE in September about the longest and hardest deal of my lifetime, which includes RJR, which was a joint venture, if you will, between the Rockefeller Foundation, JP Morgan, and USAID, and getting a deal from smallholder farmers that actually delayed my retirement so much. And just as an observation, it's very, very difficult, but it's very, very important. And as many of you do know, I guess, Duke's been recently awarded a relatively large grant from USAID on how to help the government become more aware of what private sector needs are, because there's just not enough money in DFID, which is the UK, or some of the PFIs, development finance institutions in Europe, or USAID to solve this problem. So they're working on that. Another question we're here to talk about is healthcare. Of course, there's always a question that says, talk about healthcare. Of course, healthcare, just as many people that I think one of our other biggest concentrations is health sector management here at Fuqua. And of course, healthcare is 18% of GDP, unless I fell asleep yesterday and now it's up to 19%. How do you look at healthcare within the portfolio of your activities, and where do you see the interventions that your work can do at Pershing Square, or Pershing Square Foundation?
Before I moved to New York to take on this new role, the last visit I did looking at healthcare projects was looking at maternal health issues in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is a country where maternal mortality has worsened by a factor of more than 10 in the last 20 years. They had the near collapse of the health system around the time before they dollarized the economy. And I was looking at rural clinics about 2 or 3 hours outside Harare and looking at really basic needs. They weren't the right kind of delivery beds. The incubators were broken. They didn't have a working autoclave, so it was difficult even to do cesareans that they needed to do. So these are in fairly sophisticated facilities, relatively sophisticated facilities in theory. And I was like, this is not a question of science. That's not the problem in healthcare. It is a question of delivery. And what my thought at the time was, I don't want to reinvent the solution to this through what I was doing. Where do I go to? At Pershing Square, and I claim no credit for this because it had started before I joined, one of the most interesting programs that I have seen is an initiative actually coming out of Harvard called the Global Health Delivery Project, which was established actually as a joint program between Paul Farmer, who runs the Department of Global Health, founder of Department of Health, and Michael Porter at the business school, where they were saying, how do we take the good things that the business school brings together with the expertise in global health, gather delivery knowledge and distribute that around the world. And they are now deeply involved, particularly in Rwanda. And they, again, to your question, the previous question on partnership with government, have a partnership with government where they are training huge numbers of healthcare workers, and actually they're transferring the curriculum that they developed at Harvard to be delivered in Rwanda by Rwandans in healthcare delivery. And I mean, Rwanda has some of the best improving statistics in health in the continent. And it has a real on-the-ground practical help and is being embedded within the country. And with them last week in Boston, and in the conversation we're having is what does it take for other countries to adopt similar principles so that they can spread the knowledge, and again, whenever they face a problem, not just reinvent a solution that is out there, be able to share it and gain it and get it from somewhere else. And that I found it's not. I'm not inclined normally towards academic-based projects with all the appropriate respect to academics, but to see that practically delivered, I thought is phenomenal.
So right now, I'm just thinking, how I would have responded a year ago. See, I agree with you. And now my professor hat on, I should be offended. Two things. I just had two final points, and I just really want to put up two questions. The question we're most asked, anyone involved in this activity, is the trade-off between social return and financial return. Just give your views on that question, because the question is always asked. What are your views?
Well, that is a tough one, obviously, and it's one that I think it's important to note what you said earlier about the lexicon and this new discussion that is brand new and things that have never been mentioned before. And I think we're all trying to run as fast as we can to answer this question and to figure it out, because it's being asked so frequently and it's started to dominate the sector. I think there's a little danger to that. It's to start off in terms of what I'm saying, in the sense of we can't, just because some paradigm shift doesn't mean we can just disregard everything that's come before and say that this is 100% the right way of looking at things, because if that were always true, we wouldn't keep shifting. I think that's important. As far as what I've seen out there, I think there is a huge role for what I would kind of term a social return out there. I think that obviously the market is an incredible force and can control quite a bit. I think in the Deputy Prime Minister's speech this morning, he talked about integrating human needs and a human need goal into your business model, and the money will come. I think that's true, but once you are then guided by profit, then at some point you will start following that profit in order to keep your company alive. And I think that there's something to be said for staying focused on that social return. Now that can be in a project that does also seek profits, or it can be an organization that is purely guided by that social return. And I think sometimes there's something to be said for that organization that is guided purely by that social return, because it's staying focused on the original goal. Companies have a tendency to morph based on their driving objectives. So even the greatest social return companies can be, let's say, donor-driven to go in many different directions. But if an organization can manage to outline a set of principles at the beginning and stay focused on those, that's when they're going to be most successful. So if they are honest with kind of their investors from the beginning, that this is the social return we intend to produce, this is what you're investing in, then a lot of things are possible, and then you're going to find the most effective organization.
That honesty up front, I think, is hugely important. There are going to be occasions, as we heard this morning from the Deputy Prime Minister, where you find the slam dunk that sort of says, well, everything's beautifully aligned and you can achieve both and everyone can be perfectly happy. There are going to be other times where there are trade-offs. And having and I don't think there's going to be any one rule that ultimately governs this. I think there's a desperate search for an answer to this question, which I'm not sure exists, and people are going to have to work out their level of comfort with it, which is effectively what a lot of businesses do already. And there's now a lot more talk about being a socially responsible business to your core. But actually, Walmart was an example this morning. They did do a wonderful thing by discovering that actually, if they changed their energy policy, they not only could do something good for the world and save carbon, they could also save themselves a lot of money. It's a good thing, but of course, there are plenty of critics of Walmart for their employment practice and a whole bunch of other things. That doesn't necessarily mean that when you look at it in its fullness, you would hold it up to be this is your ultimate example of perfect alignment between profit and social good. Although we, in some of our discussions in our board meetings, we've had the discussion that says, well, what is the greater contributor of social good? Is it Home Depot with the number of jobs it creates, or Walmart the number of jobs it creates, or some other alternative for of a social change that isn't, and we can have that sort of philosophical debate. What I think for those who are trying to focus on a double or a triple bottom line, I'll just stick to the double bottom line. But the first piece is being able to measure that, the social side of it. It's relatively easy to measure the financial, but measure the social side as well, so you know what it is you're trying to achieve. And then secondly, having a point of view up front, which may or may not play out in reality, but a point of view up front, what will you do if things don't go as sweetly as you like, and there is at some point a set of choices to be made when they are potentially in conflict. You think you've got a fantastically successful business model, it does incredibly well, but maybe due to external forces there's a downturn, and then you've got to keep your business alive. But maybe that forces you into a trade-off over, let's say one of your things is about the amount you pay your workers. Use that as an example. You're under severe pressure. If you pay your workers at 2 or 3 times the market rate, if that's the policy, that's what you've chosen as your impact, and you're about to go out of business, what do you do about it? So to have thought at the beginning about how will I deal with the trade-offs, what expectations have I set among my investors if you have set it up as an equity-based, even if you're taking debt as well, whatever is your financial structure, whether it's investors or donors, what do they expect me to do if I find there's a trade-off between these things? And then, as I say, you may discover the world when you actually hit reality is different from what you expected, but at least then you've got a plan as to how you're going to handle the conflict when it's arises, which would make it a lot easier to manage through the chain of stakeholders that you've got around the business.
Well, let's have some, let's have some, I think we've covered everything there is to cover, but let's have some questions from the audience.
Thank you. It's been great. I used to work for CHF International, so I can emphasize there. Touched on with Ted Fire London. I'm going to work for John Deere, I did out of here, and we're very interested in Africa as an emerging market. Big scaled-up farms using big tractors, but also small farms using smaller tractors. But I'm wondering, what would you guys say is the best way that Deere could invest in terms of trying to do CSR or help support rural livelihoods?
I'll let you
Yeah,
start.
obviously one of the big debates, I'm sure you know more about it than I do, is around the protection of farmers, particularly protection of smallholder farmers. What happens to land rights? How historically, it doesn't have to necessarily be like this in the future, but historically, the process of creating efficiency in the farming sector has disenfranchised huge numbers of people, and you know the stories that go with it. Even though we're involved in supporting organisations that are deeply active with smallholders, of whom there are 50 million or so, but that's the really smallholders, not even those that are dealing in some of the next level activities. I don't know whether that's the efficient model for agriculture in Africa in the future. I'm not an expert in it. I'm trying to learn more as we go along. But I think the interesting question for those that have technology that can be really valuable to the value add that can be made in any agricultural environment is how can I work with my customers to do it in an ethical way and not sort of, the kind of classic, eventually the machine replaces the person, and because I can't see the person that got driven off their land by someone, just coming in and buying it, or it being taken forcibly, whatever that is. So there is a role there, and also being creative on how to the extent, I mean, I remember studying this when I was studying English history of how the farms gradually grew and were built, and sort of course that first role of sharing machinery with your neighbours. So how do people actually work together? And that doesn't necessarily undermine their own livelihoods, but they will work with their neighbour, which could involve some fairly innovative financing schemes for how machinery gets sold or leased or whatever is the environment. And that's what is interesting about groups like 1 Acre, is because they're just trying to tackle those. The problem that the individual has, that they don't have the buying power or the selling power to really operate efficiently in the market, and how they can work in an ethical way with them to deliver more effectively.
And also remember, according to the Deputy Prime Minister, we're not supposed to say CSR anymore. I think the advice I can give, and it's not around agriculture because I'm not an expert, is more just around looking at the communities that surround these farms and talking to champions from within these communities as to what are the, just use a term from before, human needs here. Where are the gaps? Is there no hospital for miles? You know, there's so many different things that you'll find once you get involved, and the problems run really deep. But it's identifying where money can go a long way in supporting the children and other family members as well, because you'll find that production drops when all of these other needs are being met.
Question? Yes, sir.
Paul, I know you mentioned about trying to support organizations at their inflection point, and Jordan, you also pointed out the need for organizations to have the right resources, the right financing, rather than just this dollar-a-day mentality. I guess I'm wondering from both of your perspectives, when you engage an organization or support an organization, what are your constraints? Like, are you committed to supporting their overhead and making sure they have the right resources and that they're increasing whatever office space that they need? Or are you challenged and you always focus on that outcome indicator and you're primarily concerned with expansion of activities? I'm wondering how you balance those two for the longer term.
Well, maybe I'll talk about what it's like from a donor, and then you can think about it, and also we can pick up on some of those measurement points and how they either help or distort your business, and without even you necessarily having to be that far. I mean, our aim is to support the organisations in their growth, which means that as much as possible our funding is unrestricted growth finance. That the organisation may choose to allocate to a particular area. So they may have a particular project that they want to grow, or they may come to us asking for that. But generally speaking, we'll support their expansion. We will certainly fund overhead because it's part of it. We'll look at the overhead, and there's some interesting ways to be had around it. And what I regard as smart measurement are the measures that management is using, or in some cases ought to be using, to run a successful business. I remember having this debate when I moved from South Africa to London, and I moved from being the person running the operation to the person who was overseeing the operation, at a point where we were trying to design the data systems to support it, and they kept saying, "Oh, you're so demanding, the board is so demanding, just tell us what you want us to tell you and we'll get the data for you." And my answer was always the same: I want to know what is the data that enables you to be effective in managing your business. And that's the data I want to see.
Very refreshing to hear all those words, especially the word unrestricted. if any of you have managed to talk about donor expectations, the word unrestricted, and it's funny, but it's a real point of debate and a major point of interest for me. The word unrestricted in NGO funding, because you have these restrictions, and the overhead restriction is the biggest one. Okay, overhead is this dirty word, and you know I'm regurgitating some points I've heard elsewhere, so these are not my brilliant points. But you know, when you look at the salaries and you're trying to drive a business, I'm sitting here with MBA students who are going to choose their future career based on what offers you get from, and obviously your interests as well, but what offers you get. So if we want the cream of the crop, you guys are here at this session, right, because I assume you're interested in some form of what we do in terms of development. But are you going to shy away from that career path because somebody I heard say, well, listen to this. You know, if you're an MBA out of school 10 years, you make a certain amount. And the same NGO salary after that amount of time, or after longer actually, is like, let's just say $200,000 less generously. So why not take the high-paying job, make the $100,000 donation to the organization that you like, sit on the board, and you'll be my boss. And you'll probably get an award for it. So why not take that road? And the answer is you probably should take that road at this point. But if we can change the conversation to more along the lines of what Paul's saying, it's not that you should all of a sudden start increasing all NGO salaries. Some NGOs are horribly mismanaged, and the money's going nowhere good. So are some businesses, I think we've all found out. So the point is, why don't we judge NGOs and audit them, you know, in a broad concept, I'm not talking about an actual, just an audit, but in the same way we would a business and look at bad management practices and good management practices and worthy salaries and unworthy salaries. So I'm not a funder. I'm a recipient of funding, so you're getting that perspective, just to be clear. But I think that we need to be more sophisticated in the way we look at overhead. And I think if I were a funder, I would definitely want to do it that way, get very involved and understand the data that's coming out, the outputs that are coming out, and how the organization is being managed before I make those decisions.
John,
sure.
I was just going to bring you into it in terms of how you're seeing that question playing out as people look at impact investment.
Well, from the traditionally, what we're looking at is you look at impact investing one of two ways: either as a transition from philanthropy, or as a transition from money management investment banking, and they come out of both different. What I personally have found, being on one side of the side, but also speaking with a lot of the ultra high net worth people, is that because they've made their money in results organizations and they want to see the impact, that they really want, and all generalizations, including this one, is wrong, but there are many who on it's not sexy to say, well, I funded the new IT system for the business in rural Africa. They want to be able to have pictures of the crop and the smiling face of, they want to see the picture of the smiling face of the kid reading the book, in your case, as opposed to seeing what it takes to get, you don't want to take a picture of the truck that takes the book, or the bookkeeper the accountant who's measuring where the books are there. And that's a challenge. And it's something that we'll have appropriate thanks again, but it's something that makes Mr. Ackman, frankly, just such a visionary in that there are people who, and Bill Gates, and the Gates Foundation is very supportive of our work, and is very supportive of our work. There's just too much of this, let's take the good picture, which makes it very difficult for people like Jordan to succeed because they're constantly taking pictures. On the other hand, from the people who come in from the finance side, is give us measurements, what's the ROE today? Can this be sustainable? We've all had a collective case in the last 20 years of like ADD, that long-term means 2 years, and 2 years is just a millisecond in this rate. So some of the business people that come in and say, measure this, measure that, and at what point, something that I'm actually writing a paper on, at what point does impact measurement sort of open Schrodinger's box, Schrodinger's cat, that you're spending so much time measuring impact that you're actually not getting anything done? There's no answers to this. This is a new field. This is really a new field. So it's just different perspectives approaching the same challenge. But I urge each of you who are going into this field to recognize that A, it's not just about impact measurement, and B, to spread the word that to run any kind of enterprise efficiently, you need a back office. You need things that don't look sexy. Nothing just grows out of the sky, goes out of the ground.
Can I just to add something? I'm not sure if this discussion has come up a little cynical or negative. I think we would definitely like to say that, from my opinion anyway. This field, because of this conversation that's going on now, because we're invited to sit here, because people are interested, because it's a whole new way of looking at the world, has progressed more, in my opinion, in maybe the last 5 years than any time in the past. And the models are getting more efficient, and people are thinking about these questions. The funding is becoming better. I still take a lot of pictures of kids reading books. I really, really do. That's not a joke. I really do. But, you know, it's getting to a point where people are studying this and intellectualizing it and figuring out, you know, where have the mistakes been made and where have these models gone awry and where are we feeding a machine that's inefficient. And I think that's a great thing. And for me, the funding world is becoming a much better place. And I just wanted to mention that because if you ask me a question, I will go out. I can sit here for hours and criticize, but I also think there's a lot of great work being done in understanding how to better fund these things and how to better implement them.
Yes,
I think we've touched on this a little bit, and I think we giggle when we talk about how far the business school world has come in terms of understanding those impact ideas. But on the back end, in terms of recommunicating impact and long-term planning and strategic planning to programs, I used to do malaria work, and one of the kids just there, you're going to kill 100 babies in the next week if you sit around and strategic plan for the next 5 years. So, I guess kind of how do you balance that? How do you balance the immediate needs and the long-term planning, but also how do you articulate that for people who need to do this?
I don't think strategic planning has to be something that takes people out of doing good and into a room forever. I mean, your example of malaria is, I think, a fascinating one. Someone, I believe, thought about not only the direct impact of pre-bed meds scaling up pre-bed, but of what that was ultimately going to lead to. Because I admit it because I now think I was wrong, being quite sceptical about the pre-bed med initiative because it felt like it was taking away a market, and my sense was at some point someone would stop paying for pre-bed meds and then we would move it. But someone had thought through the reality that said if you could bring down the incidence of malaria through that initiative, then you can have a massive impact. And just the fall in child mortality rates in countries like Kenya, which has now proved that case, I think is an extraordinary testament. So they did some thinking, but they didn't spend years doing it. They got on with it.
And let's look at if I could follow up on that. Your point of view, free versus unfree or rented bed nets. It's sort of a microcosm. The bed net issue, for those of you not aware of, is to me the microcosm of all the issues of whether or not people respond to incentives. Is it bad to give away things? What's your view? Or what have you seen? What have you seen in practice?
Well, I think that case is a good example of there not being any single answer. But we've been very involved in supporting something called Kickstart, which what they do is they supply hand or leg operated pumps, very robust, very good pumps to farmers who've got a water table that's accessible. And the use of irrigation is an introduction to irrigation has phenomenal impact. You can multiply income by many times. And we've had many debates with them about if it really has that much impact, why doesn't someone just give them away? And Martin Fisher, who was the founder of the organisation, he was saying from all his experience, and they've been many tens of thousands of pumps, that they were finding that when they were given away, the pumps might just sit there because someone wasn't really paying attention to it. When someone's paid for it, they're making real use of it and getting real benefits. So that was their feedback to us about how they found their model. And the problem being they're not cheap. And how they achieve scale and sometimes sustainability.
Oh, sorry. I just have to just first of all, the person that said to you that theater is absolutely ridiculous. That's just a ridiculous thing to say. And if they've been on the ground at all and seen the difference between a planned initiative that reaches however many people and is thought out and has a plan and walking around and handing out 100 benefits, it's a totally different. It's not even the same thing. And of course, the strategic planning plays a huge role. Just on this question briefly, absolutely, people disregard a lot of things they get for free. And I all over, this pen is free, so I'm not going to take that much care of it, sorry. But, it actually, but I just think there's a difference between, and where we have to get this. There are certain things that can be given away for free within a larger spectrum, meaning like the ARV drugs, it's great that they're free, but it doesn't mean that if you're working with a client who's at a clinic and getting their ARVs for free, everything else that they get from an organization or a system has to be free as well. You can earn, but within that, to be able to give certain things is great. But it's it's another question that ends up being very complex when you look at it.
Yes, ma'am.
My mom is from South Africa. My dad is from Zimbabwe. And I was raising profession. I was in South Africa. I don't know stuff. And there's an article I read, and it was something very important especially for girls. Maybe you guys have read it about AIDS in young kids, teenagers. I think it was about 65% girls were infected with AIDS, teenagers. And 4% were boys. It bothers me that the organization, I understand you guys are doing this organization. You guys, are you doing anything for education to educate these kids? Because these young girls, I feel like they're being raped and nobody's doing much on that. If you guys put an impact on finding the AIDS and all this stuff, are you doing something on educating these girls, these kids about AIDS? And most of these kids have lost their parents. They have no mentors around them. You guys, are you doing something for them?
Absolutely. You've touched on, this Nelsie Boyson case. I'm not sure if you guys remember this horrific rape case that went on in South Africa recently. Where this girl, I don't want to go. It's horrific. It's violent. It's disgusting. The acceptance of rape, which is one of the issues that I think is one of the sickest things I've ever seen, and this is not unique to South Africa, right? But there are places in different societies where you find that rape becomes an accepted thing, and it's treated not as the horrific crime it is. That has to be stopped at a young age. It has to be stopped with education. In fact, our founder just co-wrote an editorial, actually with Desmond Tutu, about this, about bringing rape as a discussion to the home. So you get home, you talk to your kids, you talk about all these issues, but are we going to address the really hard ones that do that? So what we do to address that is as I've explained very briefly, we haven't had a lot of time here, but our models hire from within the community. So our counselors who provide psychosocial support are people who were born and raised in the same communities as the children that they're working with. And they are trained then on the skills to talk about these tough issues and talk about everything from life skills in terms of safe sex and prevention to issues like rape. We find it's most effective when it's delivered locally and delivered within a context that both the person delivering it and the person receiving it understand. So absolutely, we think that's got to be addressed, or else you're going to find those statistics rising instead of dipping.
That's okay.
One other question bothers me, is going to agriculture goes to all these rural areas in Africa. I understand, like was saying about land issue in Africa hasn't been, the laws were written 100 years ago and nothing has been done. And take for instance, like in terms of agriculture, I've been to Rwanda. I went to Rwanda just to see how they were doing and all that stuff. I work for GE, I went in there and how the agriculture is brought people like in the rural areas. Take for instance, people like Walmart, you know what I'm saying? We have spas, we have Woolworth and all those places. But what I noticed in South Africa, there's some small farmers there, you know what I'm saying? And I know my black folks are far black of agriculture, learn how to farming and all that stuff. But, you know, they can be taught. But what I noticed, how in the world, the fruits can come from, there's a farmer, a black farmer in South Africa, who's farming right over here, he's struggling selling his fruits on the street. And yet there's a Woolworth,
Yes.
Walmart. And why can't Woolworth can buy those vegetables from them, and they're doing the same thing? That's what is lacking in Africa, and none of them are addressing those small farmers which are struggling. And people end up moving in the urban areas, and they're struggling, barely making it, because everybody's run away from the rural areas, because nobody's put its impact on that. I know I blame the government and all that stuff, but there are some goals who are helping with, we're going to give you our farming stuff, agriculture and all that stuff, and they only do seasonal stuff, and nobody's digging wells for them and say, okay, we're going to dig your well, and like that, what happened in Zimbabwe, the farmers, when they took over the irrigation, they closed all the whatever in the world and all that stuff, nobody knows. And now there's no food in Africa because there are no wells, nobody's doing that. And gods will come in with the seedlings, and there's some seedlings you can farm, and there's no rain. And nobody's teaching them the right thing, what to do. And sometimes when I look at some of the laws, the way they run, it's absolutely ridiculous. You know what I'm saying? Nobody's bringing that impact, and the government doesn't care. They just pay the government, but it doesn't pay. If anybody look into those goals, you guys look what can we help? Because you can't keep on giving Africa. Africa has to bring it up. Keep on giving, you get a handout. That won't work. You know what I'm saying? That won't work.
Yeah.
Some here have
Yes.
even if like the guy says he worked for John Deere, he's planning to go sell the equipment in Africa. I think John Deere, black folks would be interested by those, but what they have to come up with a program and teach them to do the right thing.
So I think you're right, and on a number of levels. Firstly, and coming back to John's first question about what's changed in our thinking, which is the getting away from the handout culture, as you say. And,
that's the problem in Africa.
I don't think it's accurate in every sense, but when the book came out a few years ago called Dead Age, written by Dambisa Moyo, who's a Zambian
Yes.
economist, a phenomenal person. As I say, I think Dambisa's a friend, so I say this. I don't think he was right in every way, but Dambisa's point was, break that cycle of dependence, because just history tells us that it didn't change things in the last 30, 40 years. So why, if we do the same thing again, do we assume it's going to be different in the next 30, 40 years? I think there are two specifics on the agriculture. One is, sometimes there are good examples of local sourcing, and I remember seeing some of them in Cape Town when I lived there, but not enough that can help with local produce. And then the other piece I think you're saying is the importance of people working on the supply chain, and not just in terms of how does Walmart or its equivalents, whether it's Woolworths or Pick n Pay or whoever, know how to buy locally, and the farmers know how to get to them and actually get a price that they deserve to earn, as opposed to the price that some middleman doesn't exploit them to get on the day they happen to need to get rid of their produce, because they don't have the transport and he does. And how you broker those things and provide the training and the technologies, as we were talking about before. There's a certain amount going on with that, and it's more mature in some sectors, less relevant to South Africa. But in other parts, things like the coffee supply chain is relatively mature because of the way cooperatives have developed, and the fair trade movement obviously developed around coffee. And you see some very interesting things, and there was an article I think this weekend in the New York Times about trying to take that even further in terms of the difference in the price of selling the beans and then the difference of selling the fully roasted, so after all the value add has gone into it, and how you can get to a point where the farmer not just gets a fair trade price, which is better than it might have been, or it would be when coffee prices are depressed, but actually shares in that, in the end, profit. And how do you get that to flow back to them? And I mean, I think it was in Sunday's New York Times. It's worth a look.
And one thing I'd like to close with, because we have to get ourselves back to the plenary panel. For many of you who are thinking of getting involved in social change, poverty alleviation, entrepreneurship, or regular way business, let me just close with 5 years ago, I mean, all my career had been spent in either law or investment banking in Chicago, New York, or London. And I realized quickly that I didn't really understand poverty. So therefore, the ideas of social change, I had to understand poverty, and I really didn't understand supply chains or understand the communities in which globally JP Morgan at the time was going to work. So I found my subject matter experts, et cetera, and it's still bewildered. But I cannot stress enough that if you want to be involved in this as an activity, getting to know that community. And for example, I could not get my arms around quickly enough the kind of work in Africa and Asia. So I picked up a book. I'd always planned to study this work history, so I reread a book I'd read, London Labor and the London Poor, written around the time of Dickens, where this author